The shell screamed in from somewhere invisible, somewhere beyond the narrow streets and thick Norman hedgerows, and exploded against the Tiger's drive sprocket with a sound like a church bell cracking in half. 60 tons of German steel lurched to a stop in front of the Hewitt Godefroy clothing store on Rue Georges Clemenceau, smoke pouring from its shattered running gear. Inside the tank, SS-Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, already the most famous Panzer Ace in the Wehrmacht with 119 confirmed kills, sat stunned. His Tiger had just carved through an entire British armoured column like a scythe through wheat. In 15 minutes of fury, he had destroyed or crippled more than 24 vehicles. The morning of June 13, 1944 had belonged to him, until it didn't. The shot that stopped him came from an alley. A single British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, hastily positioned, crew exposed, firing at point-blank range into the most feared tank in the world. But that's not the story you came here for, is it? The title promised you 14 Panzers stopped by one gun. 47 rounds fired at a single heroic crew holding the line against impossible odds. Here's what actually happened at Villers-Bocage, and I promise you, the truth is more remarkable than any myth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. 7 days after D-Day, the British Second Army was stuck. While American forces ground forward through the hedgerows of western Normandy, the British offensive toward Caen, the key city that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had promised to capture on day one, had stalled completely. The problem wasn't courage or determination. The problem was that Adolf Hitler had packed every available Panzer division into the British sector. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the 21st Panzer Division, and the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most powerful armoured formations in the German military. By June 12, 1944, British XEX Corps had been battering its head against German defences around the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles for days. Every attack met a counterattack. Every gain cost blood. The front had frozen solid, but then American forces opened a gap. The US 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, pushed south from Omaha Beach and broke the German 352nd Infantry Division. The overstretched German lines snapped. Between the Americans at Caen and the British struggling at Tilly, an 8-mile gap opened in the German front. Lieutenant General Gerard Bucknell, commanding XX Corps, saw an opportunity. If British armour could punch through that gap and sweep around behind the German defences, they might trap the Panzer Lehr Division and finally take Caen from the west. The mission went to the 7th Armoured Division, the legendary Desert Rats, who had fought with Montgomery from El Alamein to Tunisia. And leading the spearhead would be the 22nd Armoured Brigade, with the 4th County of London Yeomanry, the sharpshooters, at the very tip of the advance. Their objective, a small Norman town called Villers-Bocage. Population, maybe 2,000. A road junction. High ground to the east at a feature called Point 213. Militarily insignificant. Except it wasn't, because Villers-Bocage sat astride the main highway to Caen. And whoever controlled Villers-Bocage controlled the road network for miles around. The British knew this. So did the Germans. On the night of June 12th, as the Desert Rats assembled for their advance, 2 companies of Tiger tanks from the SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, 101, rolled into position south of Villers-Bocage. They had been driving for 5 days from their base near Paris, constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers. Of the 45 Tigers that started the journey, fewer than 20 remained operational, but even 20 Tigers represented a terrifying concentration of firepower. The commander of 2nd Company was 30-year-old SS-Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann. By June 1944, Wittmann was a celebrity in Germany. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the Reich's highest decorations. His combat record on the Eastern Front read like fiction: 119 tanks destroyed, 132 anti-tank guns eliminated. German propaganda had turned him into a Superman. Newspapers published his photo. Radio programs broadcast his interviews. The propaganda ministry needed heroes, and Wittmann delivered. But on the night of June 12, 1944, Wittmann wasn't thinking about propaganda. He was thinking about mechanical problems, fuel shortages, and the fact that his company had only 6 Tigers ready for action. He positioned his small force south of Point 213, camouflaged in the hedgerows along the old Caen road, and then he waited. The British advance began before dawn on June 13th. The 4th CLY, 55, with Cromwell tanks, 6 Sherman Fireflies mounting the deadly 17-pounder gun, 11 light Stuart tanks, and all the support vehicles that an armoured column needed, rolled through the darkness without opposition. They reached Villers-Bocage at 7 a.m. Still no resistance. The lead squadron, A Squadron, commanded by Major Cranley, pushed straight through the sleeping town and out the eastern side, heading for Point 213. Behind them came the regimental headquarters group, then B Squadron, then C Squadron. The entire column, strung out along the narrow road, nose to tail, vehicles parked so close together you could walk along the column without touching the ground. At Point 213, A Squadron halted. The tank commanders climbed out, stood on their turrets, lit cigarettes, some brewed tea, using small portable stoves balanced on their engine decks. The morning was quiet, almost peaceful. The smell of baking bread drifted from the village behind them. Major Wright, commanding the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade Infantry, who had accompanied the advance in half-track carriers, called a conference. All officers and senior NCOs gathered around him at the head of the column to discuss the defensive position they would establish. It was approximately 8 a.m. The sun climbed over the Norman countryside. Birds sang in the hedgerows, and then Sergeant O'Connor of the Rifle Brigade, travelling in his half-track toward the meeting at Point 213, screamed into his radio, "Good God, we have to get out of here. There is a Tiger tank progressing about 50 meters from us." Wittmann had been watching them for at least 20 minutes. From his concealed position south of the road, he had observed the entire British column drive past his hiding place. Less than 600 meters away, he saw the tanks. He saw the soft-skinned vehicles packed with infantry. He saw officers standing in the open, pointing and gesturing. His training told him to fall back and report. His orders were to observe, not engage. The proper military response would be to radio back to headquarters, bring up the other Tigers, coordinate with the Panzer Division, and plan a proper counterattack. But Wittmann didn't fall back. He charged. At 8 a.m. precisely, Wittmann's Tiger burst from the tree line onto Route Nationale 175. His gunner, SS-Obersturmführer Balthasar Voll, traversed the turret and fired. The rearmost Cromwell of A Squadron at Point 213 exploded. 1 round, 1 kill. A Sherman Firefly tried to return fire. Woll destroyed it with the next shot. The Firefly erupted into flames and slewed across the road, blocking the only exit from Point 213. Panic erupted. Radio discipline collapsed. Commanders screamed contradictory orders. Wittmann's Tiger prowled along the stranded column like a shark among swimmers, firing methodically. 3 more Cromwells died in as many minutes. Behind Wittmann came the other 4 Tigers of his company, plus a single Panzer IV from Panzer Lehr. They spread out and began the slaughter. The packed vehicles of the Rifle Brigade, half-tracks, Bren carriers, trucks, had nowhere to go. The hedgerows hemmed them in. Most weren't armed. The riflemen tumbled out and ran for the woods as 88mm shells ripped through thin armor like paper. In less than 5 minutes, the British advance guard ceased to exist as a fighting force. But Wittmann wasn't finished. He left the other Tigers to finish off a squadron and turned his tank west, back toward Villers-Bocage. His reasoning was simple. If he could reach the town before the British realized what was happening, he could cut off the entire British column, trap them, destroy them all. He roared back down the road at top speed, his 60-ton Tiger scattering gravel and churning the Norman dirt. The 3 Stuart light tanks of the reconnaissance troop sat at the crossroads near Point 213. Their commanders heard the explosions, saw smoke rising, knew something terrible was happening. But tanks aren't built to fight Tigers. They should have run. They didn't. Lieutenant Rex Ingram, commanding the lead Stuart, deliberately positioned his 13-ton tank across the road to block Wittmann's advance. While fired, the Stuart exploded, its turret blown completely off the hull. The second Stuart met the same fate. The third erupted in a ball of flame that sent black smoke spiraling into the morning sky. Wittmann rammed Ingram's burning wreck aside and continued toward Villers-Bocage. Now he was alone. No infantry support, no other tanks. One Tiger. Driving into a town occupied by an unknown number of British tanks and infantry, it was, by any reasonable military standard, insane. The first British tanks he encountered were from the regimental headquarters group, 4 Cromwells parked near the eastern entrance to the town. The crews were inside their tanks, but not expecting combat. They were in administrative mode, studying maps, checking equipment. Wittmann destroyed 2 of them in seconds. The other 2 reversed frantically, trying to get off the road. One commander, Captain Pat Diaz, the 4th CLY adjutant, managed to tuck his Cromwell behind a small barn. Wittmann drove past him and continued into the town centre. On the main street, Rue Georges Clemenceau, he encountered the artillery observation tanks of 5th Royal Horse Artillery. These were Shermans and Cromwells, fitted with radios and dummy guns, completely unarmed. Wittmann's gunner destroyed them methodically. The intelligence officer's scout car, the medical officer's half-track, anything that moved. Villers-Bocage was a small town and sound carried. The crash of 88mm gunfire echoing off the stone buildings brought men running. Lieutenant Charles Pierce, driving a scout car, came racing around a corner and nearly collided with the Tiger. He hit the brakes, spun the wheel, and went screaming back the way he'd come to warn B Squadron. At the Place Jeanne d'Arc, the western end of the main street, Sergeant Stan Lockwood commanded a Sherman Firefly from B Squadron's 2nd Troop. He was 30 years old, a veteran, and his Firefly mounted the only gun in the British infantry that could reliably kill a Tiger from the front, the 17-pounder. Pierce's scout car came sliding around the corner, Pierce waving his arms frantically and shouting. Lockwood didn't need an explanation. He could hear the battle. His crew was already closed up, engine running. Lockwood positioned his Firefly at the corner and waited. Long minutes passed. The sound of gunfire continued up the street. Lockwood's gunner peered through his sight, finger on the firing pedal. Finally, Lockwood's patience broke. He nosed the Firefly around the corner to see what was happening. 200 meters away, Wittmann's Tiger was firing into a side street. Turret traversed away from Lockwood. The Firefly's 17-pounder spoke 4 times in rapid succession. One round hit the Tiger's hull, producing a jet of flame and smoke. The impact damage was superficial. The Tiger's armor was too thick. But it achieved something more important. It got Wittmann's attention. The Tiger's turret began traversing toward Lockwood. Wittmann's gunner fired. The 88mm shell missed the Firefly, but hit a building next to it. The building collapsed. Inside, a German sniper who had been watching the battle from an upper window died as the floors gave way. The collapsing building showered debris onto Lockwood's Firefly. By the time he dug himself out, the Tiger was gone. Wittmann had decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He retreated back up Rue Georges Clemenceau, heading for the eastern exit and safety. But Captain Pat Diaz, whose Cromwell had been bypassed earlier, had been following the Tiger through the streets, looking for a shot at its thinner rear armor. As Wittmann withdrew, Diaz emerged from his hiding place and accelerated forward. At less than 100 meters, Diaz fired his 75mm gun twice. Both rounds hit the Tiger. Both rounds bounced off harmlessly. Wittmann's turret traversed. His gunner fired once. The 88mm shell tore through the Cromwell's turret, killing the gunner and driver instantly. Diaz stumbled out, bleeding from the nose and ears from the overpressure, and was immediately shot at by German infantry who had infiltrated the town. Wittmann continued east. He had now destroyed or crippled somewhere between 25 and 30 British vehicles. Incredible, unprecedented, a one-tank rampage that would become the stuff of legend. But he was running low on ammunition. His fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and he was still alone. Deep inside enemy-held territory, he reached the junction where the main road met the Route de Tilly, the northeastern edge of town. And there, positioned in an alley between 2 buildings, was a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun. The crew was from the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade. They had been trying to set up their position when the Tiger had come roaring through 15 minutes earlier, and they'd been forced to abandon their gun and scatter. Now, they were back. The gun was loaded. The crew was exposed. There was no shield, no protection, but they were in position. The gunner's name was Sergeant Bray. Some sources say he got off 2 shots, some say only 1. But the details don't matter. What matters is that at 9:30 a.m. on June 13th, 1944, Sergeant Bray's 6-pounder fired at point-blank range into the drive sprocket of Wittmann's Tiger. The 57mm armor-piercing round punched through the sprocket and shattered it. The Tiger lurched to a stop, immobilized. Wittmann tried to traverse his turret to return fire, but the angle was impossible. The Tiger sat dead in the street, smoke rising from its damaged running gear. For the next 20 minutes, Wittmann used his machine guns and his main gun to fire at anything that looked like a target, keeping British troops at bay. And then he and his crew bailed out and made their way on foot 6 kilometers north to the Panzer Division headquarters at the Château d'Orbois. He had left his Tiger, the first Tiger tank, lost in Normandy, sitting in Villers-Bocage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By noon, the situation was chaos. At point 213, a squadron was trapped. 9 tanks remained operational, but they were surrounded by German infantry and cut off from the rest of the brigade. Major Wright of the Rifle Brigade organized a perimeter defense, but everyone knew they were in serious trouble. In Villers-Bocage itself, the town was held by elements of B Squadron, 4th CLY, and the 1st Battalion, 7th Queen's Royal Regiment, which had arrived as reinforcement. The Queen's infantry quickly secured the railway station and began house-to-house clearing operations against German infantry who had infiltrated during the morning chaos. To the west of Villers-Bocage, the rest of the Desert Rats sat in confusion. Brigadier Looney Hind, commanding the 22nd Armoured Brigade, tried to make sense of contradictory reports. Should they push forward? Pull back? Reinforce Villers-Bocage? The Germans, meanwhile, were reacting with characteristic speed. At the Château d'Orbois, Wittmann briefed Major Kurt Kaufmann, the chief of operations for Panzer Lehr. The British had pushed deep into German territory. They were spread out, vulnerable. If the Germans could hit them hard and fast, they might drive them out of Villers-Bocage entirely. Kaufmann ordered Hauptmann Helmut Rittgen to assemble a counterattack force. 15 Panzer IV tanks from the 6th Company, 2nd Battalion, Panzer Lehr Regiment 130, plus 10 more tanks scraped together from a workshop south of the highway. Meanwhile, SS-Obersturmführer Rolf Möbius, commanding the 1st Company of the 101 SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, arrived with 9 more Tigers. The Germans were going to retake Villers-Bocage, and they were going to do it now. But the British weren't sitting idle. In Villers-Bocage, Lieutenant William Bill Cotton of the 4th CLY organized a hasty defense. Cotton was a popular officer who had risen through the ranks. He held the military medal from earlier combat. He was also, by temperament and training, the kind of officer who understood that sometimes the best defense is a good ambush. He positioned his troop of 4 tanks, including 1 Firefly and 1 close support Cromwell, mounting a 95mm howitzer at the town square, the Mairie. The square had a World War I memorial in the center and offered good fields of fire down the main street. Cotton was soon joined by infantry from the Queen's Royal Regiment and a single 6-pounder anti-tank gun, which was manhandled into position in an alley off the main street, an enfilading position that would allow the gun to fire into the flanks of any tank coming down the road. The gun crew was exposed. The position was hasty, but it had one critical advantage: surprise. At 1 p.m., the German counterattack began. Rittgen's Panzer IVs moved toward Villers-Bocage from the south. Almost immediately, they ran into a British anti-tank gun screen and lost a tank. Rittgen pulled back and regrouped. 4 Panzer IVs tried to enter the town from the southern edge. British anti-tank gunners opened fire. 2 Panzers were knocked out immediately. The others withdrew. Then Mobius's Tigers entered the fight. Mobius organized his attack in two prongs. The main force, several Tigers plus Panzer IVs, would advance down the main highway through the center of Villers-Bocage. A second group would cut through the southern part of town parallel to the main road. The Tigers advanced slowly, engines roaring and trying to intimidate the British into withdrawing. The psychological effect of a Tiger tank was considerable. Crews were supposed to feel fear. Infantry was supposed to run. But the British at Villers-Bocage had spent the morning dealing with Tigers. They were angry, not afraid. The lead Tiger, commanded by SS-Obersturmführer Philippson, rolled into the town square. Cotton's tankers held their fire, let it pass. But the tanks behind it entered the killing zone. Sergeant Bobby Bramall, commanding Cotton's Sherman Firefly, fired at a passing Tiger and missed, his round hitting a building across the street. Brick dust exploded into the air. Bramall's loader rammed another 17-pounder round into the breach. Bramall fired again. This time, the round tore into the Tiger's flank. The massive tank, shuddered, began to burn. Its commander, SS-Unterscharführer Heinrich Ernst, died in the impact. The surviving crew bailed out and ran. The 6-pounder in the alley opened a weapon fire. At point-blank range, less than 100 meters, the 57mm gun was deadly even against Tigers. The gunners fired as fast as they could reload, the breech clanging open and shut, empty brass casings piling up around their feet. One Tiger was hit. Another, a Panzer IV, exploded. The Germans tried to flank the ambush, sending Tigers through back streets. British infantry with Piat anti-tank rockets engaged them from buildings. One Tiger was knocked out, another was damaged and withdrew. The second prong of Mobius's attack ran into the same hell. British anti-tank guns positioned along the defensive line opened fire. The Germans lost tanks faster than they could identify targets. In all, the British knocked out 6 Tigers and 2 Panzer IVs during the afternoon counterattack. 3 more Tigers were damaged, but eventually repaired. The Germans also lost multiple Panzer IVs from Ritgen's force. The cost to the British was far from trivial, but this wasn't the massacre that Wittmann had inflicted in the morning. This was a fight, and the British anti-tank gunners, the men with the 57mm 6-pounders, the Sherman Firefly crews, the Piat teams, proved that even Tigers could be stopped if you had courage and good positioning. For their actions during the defense of Villers-Bocage, Lieutenant Cotton received the Military Cross, Sergeant Bramall received the Military Medal, but the battle wasn't over. By mid-afternoon, Brigadier Hind made the decision to withdraw from Villers-Bocage. The position was too exposed. German reinforcements were arriving. The 2nd Panzer Division was reportedly moving into the area, which would trap the desert rats between 2 German armored formations. At sundown on June 13th, the British pulled back 3 kilometers west of Villers-Bocage and established a defensive position called the Brigade Box, an all-around defense that could hold against attacks from any direction. Villers-Bocage itself was left to the Germans, and that night, RAF bombers plastered the town with 1,700 tons of high explosives to prevent the Germans from using it as a staging area. The next day, June 14th, the Germans attacked the Brigade Box. It was a vicious fight. The British held, but by nightfall, on June 15th, Hind ordered a complete withdrawal. The attempt to outflank Caen had failed. So, did a single 57mm anti-tank gun stop 14 Panzers at Villers-Bocage? Did a crew reload 47 times? No, not literally. The title is what YouTube calls engagement optimization. It's designed to make you curious enough to click. But here's what did happen. Multiple 6-pounder anti-tank gun crews, Sergeant Brays in the morning, others in the afternoon, stopped German armor at critical moments during the battle. Those guns, firing again and again, reloading as fast as human hands could work the breach, accounted for Tigers and Panzer IVs that were supposed to be invincible. The exact number of rounds fired by each crew isn't recorded, but crews trained to fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute. In sustained combat with ammunition bearers feeding shells with targets everywhere, those guns would have fired dozens of rounds. Sergeant Bray's gun stopped Wittmann. Other guns stopped Möbius. Guns positioned in ambush. Guns firing over open sights. Guns whose crews knew they were exposed and vulnerable but stayed at their posts anyway. The story of Villers-Bocage has been told and retold for 80 years. German propaganda turned it into a tale of Wittmann the Superman, the tank ace, who single-handedly stopped an entire British division. British historians called it a disaster. Proof that the desert rats had lost their edge. Both versions are propaganda. The truth is that Michael Wittmann made a bold, audacious attack that achieved tactical surprise and inflicted heavy casualties. His morning rampage was real. The vehicles he destroyed were real. His skill and courage were real. But he didn't do it alone. 4 other Tigers and a Panzer IV fought alongside him. And when he drove into Villers-Bocage by himself, he got stopped by Sergeant Bray and a 6-pounder gun. The afternoon counterattack failed because British anti-tank gunners and tank crews fought back effectively. 6 Tigers knocked out, multiple Panzer IVs destroyed, a German attack stopped cold by men who refused to run. The real story of Villers-Bocage isn't about supermen or disasters. It's about the brutal arithmetic of armored combat in 1944. It's about the fact that even the best tank commander in the world can be stopped by a well-positioned gun and a crew with steady nerves. It's about the fact that courage isn't just charging forward. Sometimes courage is standing behind a gun with no shield, knowing a Tiger tank is coming, knowing you're exposed, knowing you might die, and firing anyway. Let's talk about what happened next, because the aftermath of Villers-Bocage is just as revealing as the battle itself. Michael Wittmann survived June 13th. He was promoted to SS-Obersturmführer, equivalent to captain, and awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. His total score was officially recorded as 138 tanks destroyed and 132 anti-tank guns eliminated. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. Doctored photographs appeared in Signal magazine, showing 3 separate images spliced together to make the destruction in Villers-Bocage look worse than it actually was. Radio broadcasts credited Wittmann with destroying an entire British armoured regiment. Newspapers called him the savior of the Normandy front. None of it was entirely true. But truth didn't matter. Germany needed heroes in the summer of 1944, and Wittmann was a hero they could use. Wittmann himself seems to have believed his own legend. On August 8, 1944, less than 2 months after Villers-Bocage, he led a small group of Tigers in a counterattack during Operation Totalize, the Anglo-Canadian offensive toward Falaise. He drove his Tiger into open country with his flanks exposed, apparently confident that his skill and his tank's armor would protect him. A Sherman Firefly, probably from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, hit his Tiger in the turret from 500 meters. The round penetrated and detonated the ammunition. Wittmann's Tiger exploded so violently that the turret was blown off the hull. The entire crew died instantly. Wittmann was 30 years old. He was buried in an unmarked mass grave with his crew. His body wasn't positively identified until 2014, when archaeologists excavating the battlefield found his remains. The British tanker who killed him never knew he'd done it. The Firefly crew saw a Tiger explode, reported it, and moved on to the next target. War doesn't pause for irony. As for the men who fought at Villers-Bocage on June 13th, Sergeant Stan Lockwood, who engaged Wittmann with his Firefly at the Place Jeanne d'Arc, survived the war. He rarely spoke about Villers-Bocage. When historians tracked him down decades later and asked about the battle, he was matter-of-fact. He'd done his job. Lieutenant Bill Cotton, who organized the afternoon ambush, received his military cross and continued fighting through the Normandy campaign. He survived the war and lived into old age. Sergeant Bobby Bramall, whose Firefly destroyed at least 1 Tiger during the afternoon counterattack, received the military medal. Like most veterans, he came home and got on with his life. The medals went into a drawer, The memories stayed locked away. Sergeant Bray, whose 6-pounder stopped Wittmann, appears in some historical accounts and not in others. The confusion is typical of the battle. Different sources credit different gunners. What's certain is that a 6-pounder crew at the junction of Rougeauge-Clemenceau and the Route de Tilly fired at Wittmann's Tiger and hit the drive sprocket. Whether Bray personally aimed the gun or whether he commanded the crew doesn't really matter. What matters is that they stood their ground and fired. Many of them didn't survive. The 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade lost heavily at Point 213. A squadron, 4th CLY, was nearly wiped out. Captain Pat Diaz, whose Cromwell stalked Wittmann through the streets of Villers-Bocage, died from German small arms fire after bailing out of his destroyed tank. The final tally for June 13th, 1944. British losses: 217 men killed, wounded, or captured. 27 tanks destroyed. 20 Cromwells, 4 Fireflies, 3 Stuarts, 30 armoured vehicles destroyed, including half-tracks, carriers, and support vehicles. German losses: 6 Tigers destroyed, 3 damaged. 9 Panzer Ace destroyed, several damaged. Personnel casualties were relatively light. The German armour protected its crews well, but the loss of 9 Tigers in one day was significant. That was nearly half of the 101 SS Heavy Panzer Battalion's operational strength. Both sides claimed victory. The Germans held Villers-Bocage. The British withdrew. By that standard, it was a German tactical win. But the British had kept the Germans busy for 2 critical days while other operations developed. The gap near Caen remained open. American forces continued to expand their beachhead. The strategic situation hadn't changed, and the myth of Tiger invincibility had taken a beating. British troops had learned that Tigers could be stopped. That lesson would matter in the battles to come. Historians have been arguing about Villers-Bocage for 80 years. Some say Wittmann was a genius. Some say he was a glory hound who disobeyed orders and got lucky. Some say the British blundered into an ambush. Some say they fought well under impossible circumstances. The truth is probably that everyone was right and everyone was wrong. Wittmann made a bold decision that achieved surprise. He also abandoned his supporting tanks and drove alone into an enemy-held town, which was tactically insane. His attack succeeded brilliantly until it didn't. The British advanced without proper reconnaissance. They parked their vehicles nose to tail, creating a target-rich environment. But when the Germans counterattacked, British tank crews and anti-tank gunners fought back effectively and bloodied the German armour badly. The battle has been mythologized because both sides needed myths. Germany needed a hero. Britain needed an explanation for failure. And in the decades after the war, military historians and enthusiasts needed a dramatic story to tell, so the myths grew. Wittmann, the Superman, the incompetent desert rats, the invincible Tiger, the hopeless British tanks. But if you strip away the mythology and look at what actually happened, you find something more interesting than propaganda. You find human beings making decisions under impossible pressure, sometimes good decisions and sometimes bad ones, fighting with the equipment they had and the training they'd received and the courage they could muster. You find Sergeant Bray and his gun crew standing behind a 6-pounder with no shield, knowing a Tiger was coming and firing anyway. You find Lieutenant Cotton organizing an ambush in a town square while German tanks were literally rolling toward him. You find Sergeant Bramall firing his Fireflies 17-pounder at a Tiger, missing, reloading and firing again until the Tiger burned. You find men loading shells, calling targets, working breaches, passing ammunition, doing the unglamorous, terrifying work of mechanized warfare in 1944. That's the real story of Villers-Bocage. Not 14 Panzers stopped by one gun. Not one hero saving the day. Not propaganda on either side. Just men with guns doing their jobs in a small French town that most of them had never heard of before, to June 13th, 1944. The 6-pounder, the British Ordnance quick-firing 57mm anti-tank gun, doesn't get much attention in popular histories of World War II. It wasn't sexy like the 88. It wasn't massive like the Soviet 122. It wasn't American. So it doesn't show up in Hollywood movies. but it was one of the workhorses of the British Army in Normandy. The gun weighed 2,521 pounds, just over a ton. It could be manhandled by its crew over short distances, but normally it was towed by a truck or a universal carrier. The barrel was 43 calibers long, meaning the length of the bore was 43 times the diameter. With standard armor-piercing ammunition, the 6-pounder could penetrate 74 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. That was enough to kill any German tank from the side or rear. From the front, it struggled against Tigers and Panthers, but could disable them with a well-placed shot to the running gear or turret ring. And in June 1944, the British began issuing armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, ammunition for the 6-pounder. This was a tungsten core round that shed its outer casing in flight, leaving a dense penetrator that could punch through 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. With APDS, the 6-pounder could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I. Whether Sergeant Bray was using APDS ammunition when he hit Wittmann's Tiger is unknown. The sources don't specify. But it doesn't really matter, because he didn't need to penetrate the frontal armor. He hit the drive sprocket, which was mechanical, not armored. That was the key to stopping tanks in 1944. You didn't need to blow them up. You just needed to disable them. Hit the tracks, hit the running gear, hit the engine. Make them stop moving, and they become sitting targets. The 6-pounder's rate of fire was 6 to 8 rounds per minute with a trained crew. In the afternoon ambush at Villers-Bocage, with multiple guns firing. With crews that had been drilling for months, with ammunition bearers keeping the guns fed, those crews would have been firing continuously for minutes at a time. How many rounds total? We don't know. British after-action reports don't give that level of detail. But if you have 3 or 4 6-pounder guns firing 6 rounds per minute for 5 minutes of sustained combat, that's 90 to 120 rounds. Add in the 17-pounder guns from the Sherman Fireflies. Add in the 75mm guns from the Cromwells. Add in the Piat rockets from the infantry. The air in Villers-Bocage that afternoon would have been thick with smoke and cordite. The crash of gunfire would have been continuous. Empty brass casings would have been piling up around every gun position. That's what stopping 14 Panzers actually looks like. Not one gun, not one crew, but multiple positions, multiple weapons, multiple crews working together, firing and reloading and firing again until the German attack broke. There's a museum in Villers-Bocage today. It's small, privately run, dedicated to preserving the memory of June 13th, 1944. The main street has been rebuilt. The town was nearly destroyed by the fighting and subsequent bombing. But plaques mark where Wittmann's Tiger was stopped, where the afternoon ambush took place, where Captain Diaz died. British veterans visit sometimes. German veterans used to visit before they all passed away. The last survivors of the battle are gone now. The men who were there, who heard the guns and smelled the smoke and felt the fear, they've all joined their comrades who fell that day. What remains are the stories, and the question of which stories we choose to tell. For decades, the story of Villers-Bocage was Michael Wittmann's story. The tank ace, the hero, the Superman. That story sold books and made documentaries and satisfied our desire for simple narratives about good and evil and individual brilliance. But that's not the complete story. The complete story includes Sergeant Bray, Lieutenant Cotton, Sergeant Bramall, the gun crews and tank crews and infantry squads whose names don't appear in the history books because they weren't famous and they didn't give interviews to German propaganda radio, and they went home after the war and got jobs and raised families and didn't talk much about what they'd seen. The complete story includes the fact that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just staying at your post when every instinct screams at you to run, loading another shell, aiming, firing, loading again. The complete story includes the fact that warfare is collective, not individual. One man doesn't win a battle. One gun doesn't stop an attack. Victory comes from hundreds of small actions by hundreds of different people, most of whom will never be remembered. Did a single 57mm anti-tank gun stop 14 Panzers at Villers-Bocage? No. But 6-pounder crews at Villers-Bocage stopped multiple Tigers and Panzer IVs during a day of desperate fighting. They fired scores of rounds. They held their positions under impossible pressure. They proved that even the most feared tanks in the world could be stopped by determined men with the right weapons and the courage to use them. That's the story worth remembering, not the mythology, not the propaganda, not the simple narrative about heroes and villains, but the real story, the complicated, messy, human story of a battle that went wrong for everyone involved, where men on both sides fought with skill and courage and paid terrible prices. That's what happened at Villers-Bocage on June 13th, 1944. And that's why we should remember it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.